Hi, and welcome to the first half of our LinkedIn Live doubleheader on the release of the ISM Report on Business. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm senior writer and copy editor for Inside Supply Management. That's Institute for Supply Management's member publication. We're excited that you are joining us today, hopefully for a twin bill. In our opener, we will break down the Services PMI data for February. It was a pretty steady month if you look at the numbers and the industry performance. Slightly slower growth in business activity was offset by slightly faster rates of expansion in new orders, employment, and supplier deliveries. And as a result, the Services PMI increased slightly, up to 53.5%. And 14 of 18 industries reported growth. That's the same number as in January. But as you might imagine, tariffs were top of mind for many panelists, and that's definitely a dynamic we'll discuss when we break down the manufacturing PMI at 4 p.m. Eastern today, as well as the impact of cuts in the budgets and workforces at federal agencies. So it was another interesting month, and in the immortal words of Mr. Cub, Ernie Banks, let's play two. And let's bring in Steve Miller, chair of the ISM Services Business Survey Committee, to come in and take his swings. Hey, Steve, what stood out to you about the February numbers?
You know, the one thing that stood out to me most was the reading this month brought our 12-month moving average up to the highest it's been in over a year. Mm-hmm. So for me, that was good confidence that service industry is solid, performing well, and we can have some confidence that it will moving forward, barring very unusual activity, which I think none of us are counting on, but is certainly out there as a possibility.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a quote that you gave it when I discussed the economic outlook for you with you for our January-February issue. You said something to the effect of, things are going fine and things are looking good, but if there's a shock to the system, there may not be a lot of leeway, so to speak. And that's definitely what we've been getting in the last couple of days. Tariffs have been dominated the economic news, and they were evident in the panelists' comments in the prices index. We'll elaborate on that more a little bit later. But just discuss those anxieties. Especially given it at this hour, at least, there's chatter that some of the tariffs on Mexican and Canadian imports, those could be walked back as soon as today. Just discuss the environment out now.
So the key word at the moment is uncertainty within tariff issues. We're not seeing much of the activity flowing through into increased input costs. We're seeing it for aluminum. We're seeing it for steel products, and we're seeing it, at least from the commentary perspective, we're seeing it in advance contracts. So we want to lock in corn prices for a year. Canada has a big impact in that, and they obviously, the seller doesn't want to take all of the impact for locking in prices and having to cover the tariff costs, and the buyer doesn't want to absorb that if it's not going to happen. So there was some commentary that there's contracting activity that's building that in ahead of time. So even though it may not go through, the pricing that's being negotiated now may have some impacts that you can't unravel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you discussed that dynamic, and I know that was a big topic of conversation on the manufacturing side on Monday. The supplier deliveries index, the slight increase, any indication, especially in the comments that, buyers and suppliers are haggling over which party might pay tariffs, that was a big part of the discussion with manufacturing on Monday. I know last month we discussed weather issues. Are those kind of continuing? I know there was a comment by one respondent to that effect in this month's report. Just talk about, how that index shaked out this month.
Sure. The numbers look solid. So it's a slight change, no big impact, especially this time of year. There was some commentary, though, as you said, around weather impacts. If it's not snow, it's rain, I believe was one of the exact quotes. and impacting transportation. So that could be impacting it. But I think, Dan, one of the other things that was very positive was seeing the back orders or order backlog increasing to expansionary territory for the first time in a while. That together with strong economic activity and not a terrible index from slowing down of supply, I think all speaks well to the strength of the order book.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned backlogs. I did have a planned question for you for that if we have time, but yeah, no, let's camp there right now. I mean, obviously, backlogs. I know we've discussed this dynamic before. It's it's a little bit different than what you would have in the manufacturing sector, and not all services companies measure backlogs. So that dynamic is something to be taken into effect. But yeah, there was a healthy bump in February, as you pointed out. Just elaborate on some of the dynamics there.
Yeah, it's been around 44 for the last 2 months, and it hadn't been above 50 since July. So it was quite a healthy bump. It was 6.9. Although what was interesting as I was looking back through the numbers is a lot of the increases and decreases are bigger in this category than they are in a bunch of others. So up by 6, down by 6 is not an unusual occurrence. But all the numbers seem to tie together this month, Dan, where we're seeing all 4 sub-indexes of the PMI are in expansionary territory. We're seeing the inventories up, and we're seeing the order backlog up. So it all seems to indicate that we've got some strength there. And you have backlog for an IT services company. It can be software development, that type of thing. So there's that certainly measured and reported on for Wall Street is what the backlog is. But as you said, there's a significant chunk of services folks that don't report on backlog at all. So gotta just to say, you gotta moderate your focus on that number, or personally, I need to moderate my focus on that number, given that there are so many companies that don't report on that.
Right. Well, let's talk. All companies do a report on employment, which is a good thing. Was that a pleasant surprise, that index number? Highest reading since December of 2021, when it was 54.6%. And you had mentioned in some of the interviews that you've done earlier today, that the ADP employment number came out and it wasn't gangbusters. So from that standpoint, was the employment index number a nice surprise, especially as it parlays to the big federal jobs report that's going to be coming out on Friday?
It was. And one of the comments, though, that now is in my brain from one of the interviews earlier today is, so how does that, if public sector starts cutting back on jobs, what does that mean? It could have a significant impact in that number, next month, as we start seeing some of those cuts flow through. We did see cuts flow through on some of the order books or backlog and activity levels for some of the companies. We saw commentary from 8 different industries within the services sector that cuts within the federal government have impacted their business in terms of business activity or number of orders. So fingers crossed that the employment reductions are not huge for those people that are impacted, certainly, but then flow through into other economic activity.
Yeah. Just we can elaborate on that a little bit. I mean, public administration is a key industry in the services sector, and obviously the impact of cuts to the budgets and workforces are going to be felt there. I would imagine that healthcare and social assistance, that's going to be a big issue when you talk about what could potentially happen at the NIH and the CDC, and you may probably get some more insights on that when the hospital report on business comes out on Monday or Friday, excuse me. So be sure to check in on that. But yeah, just talk about elaborate on some of the biggest concerns on that as far as it relates to public administration. And you kind of, discussed how it could be felt in the report or, potentially be felt. Just elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. And in your comments, you mentioned NIH. So we're seeing NIH cuts impact university level research. So it's impacting budgets, I believe. Went from 85% funding to 15% funding in one example of research that was underway in anecdotal information, but in one of the universities that I was talking to last week. The public sector activities utilities get impacted, professional services get impacted, certainly public administration, of course, management of companies and support services gets impacted. So it gets felt in some very significant areas. Rental and leasing gets impacted. So a very large percentage of the economy can get impacted through those cuts. Certainly, a very large sector of the company gets impacted by having $1.5 trillion budget deficit every year, and the interest payments that are going to have to go into that, and taxes that are going to be required to pay those interest payments. So, short-term pain. Confidence in government. Will they actually take cuts to the bottom line, or will it be like some of the comments that we've heard from our internal clients of purchasing savings when they don't flow through back to the budget? You saved me $50 million. Where did it go? Except for we're talking about $50 billion at a time, not 50 million at a time. So I'll be optimistic for now that we'll actually see some improvement, like we saw back, I believe it was in the Clinton administration, where cuts were taken and they actually impacted the government spending and the budget deficit. But we certainly need it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably the number that outside of the headline number or the composite index number that got the most attention, as you might imagine today, was the prices index number. Not a big spike. I mean, it did grow to 62.6%. Not the big spike that we saw on the manufacturing side, but still an increase. And as you pointed out, it's the third straight reading above 60%, and that hasn't happened in a while, since 2022, I believe.
By the end of the pandemic, kind of inflationary time.
Yeah. Just what are some of the key takeaways that we should take from that reading?
So that, coupled with the commodities that we saw reported on as seeing price increases, they were pretty broad-based. We've had labor forever, for 80 months or something like that. I'm off the top of my head. Don't quote me on that one, but it's been for a long time. But corn and corn products, steel products, aluminum products, food and beverage, eggs, obviously. So we saw a lot of commodities flow through for the first time this month that were not on the report last month, and many that weren't on prior reports. So we're definitely seeing prices come through across the board for input costs going up. How that materializes into finished goods pricing or consumer pricing, that's still an open question. But for the monthly number, it's lower than what we saw in December, and it's nothing like the numbers we saw during high inflationary times, where we were up over 80, mid to high 80s even. I think 86 was the highest number, something like that, or 84. And sustained time periods over 70. We haven't seen that at all. So for me, it's a yellow flag, not a red flag, something to continue to keep watching, especially as business activity goes up. Since this is primarily a U.S. index, activity in the U.S., although, we have exports and imports included in there too. Tariffs go up. There's certainly a risk of pricing going up, or foreign goods that we can no longer buy because they're not cost effective. We buy domestic goods at the same price they were before, but they're higher than what we were buying overseas, which we certainly saw coming through in comments not only this month, but in prior months around overall impact to cost of operations. So I know I'm kind of all over the map there, Dan, on that answer, but we're seeing enough data points come through that it's a concern. But hair is not on fire yet, and it's a good thing for me because I don't have much to burn.
Well, labor is 51 consecutive months that has been up in price.
Thank you.
But yeah, I do have the list. I didn't count the number of commodities up in price, but when you get to 4 rows of commodities up in price, that's a lot.
Yes.
But you had mentioned on a call earlier today that I thought was pretty a dynamic that applies here, about the ability to pass along cost increases to customers. And, that dynamic is a little bit more different in the services sector than it is on the manufacturing side. And that might be part of the reason the spike in manufacturing was a little bit higher this month. Could you just, discuss that dynamic?
Sure. In the short term, it's tough to say no.
Mm-hmm.
In the long term, though, you can find alternatives. And so what I'd say here is that unless there's some injection of money, there's rate cuts, there's stimulus, there's only so many dollars to go around. So if you're paying more for one thing, you can't buy another. So that ends up, obviously you can kind of hear my economic kind of points of view coming through in there. But if there's not more dollars to spend, Milton Friedman says inflation isn't going to happen because people need to make choices. And then people that want to sell products drop their prices in order to get demand. So same thing happens for services. Too early to tell. We certainly didn't see inflation when the commodity tariffs went in back in March of 2018. So there's chances are we won't see it. These are really pretty broad-based though. And so it's kind of, in the short term, I think it's nearly impossible to avoid. In the longer term, though, I think market forces went out.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, let's discuss, another index where, kind of tariffs have played an impact. I know we discussed it last month. The lack of impact, so to speak, was the inventories index. And I remember we talked last month, with the tariff anxieties, the you would have expected that number to be a lot higher, and it wasn't. And this month, or in February, it did go into expansion. And the inventory sentiment index also ticked up a little bit. Have inventories, been right-sized, so to speak?
Yeah, the inventory sentiment is saying we still have too much inventory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it ticked up a bit. And one of the things that surprised me, Dan, though, was the imports number. I expected that to go into expansionary territory, people bringing in additional inventory to cover the risks of tariff increases, but it didn't. So a little bit of a surprise that both the inventory didn't go up a little bit more and that the imports number didn't go up substantially. I mean, it's hovering around 50. So, maybe it's basically the same as last month and a little bit lower than the month before. People that were out looking at lead times for buying products overseas, they needed to get in ahead of Chinese New Year. So possibility that those inventories are being received now, that's driving the inventories level up. But they were ordered back in the late 2024 time period, which were a time when we saw imports at a higher level in the overall report.
Yeah. Just for the record, not only did the imports index not go up, it contracted at a faster rate. It went down 0.2 of a percentage point to 49.6%. We like to talk about industry performance. If there are any particular industries that, stand out, that's something that I always take an interest in. None seem to really stand out this month. But, one thing that did catch my eye was that other services reported, the highest overall growth. And, we like to do tutorials on this broadcast from time to time. So, kind of discuss what are other services and, why it might have, had such a good month in February.
I have no idea, Dan. I have no idea why that went up. I believe it's everything from maintenance to housekeeping services, haircutting, things like that. I don't know. People want to enjoy themselves, and so they get their house cleaned and get their hair cut. I'm not really sure why that saw such a big increase. What I thought from an industry standpoint, though, that was curious is I expected to see weakness in some industries flow through rather than shift. And so what we saw is educational services flip from expansion to contraction. We saw management of companies and support services flip from expansion to contraction. and we saw retail trade flip from expansion to contraction, where we saw real estate rental and leasing flip from contraction to expansion, professional, scientific, and technical services breaking a 2-month trend going from contraction to expansion, and then, like you already mentioned, other services flipping. So although we still had 3 in contraction and we had 14 in expansion, the 3 in contraction flipped month over month.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah. Well, we do have a definition, and let me find it. I just had it up here. Just to get it on the record. Other services such as equipment and machinery repairing, promoting or administrating religious activities, grant making, advocacy, and providing dry cleaning and laundry services, personal care services, death care services, pet care services, photo finishing services, temporary parking services, and dating services. So and especially for anyone who was hoping to make a love connection last month, I mean, it was a great month for the industry. So congratulations to other services.
I appreciate you capturing that for me. I know I had more laundry done last month than I did the month before.
Well, it's a question that I usually ask, and I think this month definitely for sure it's a good month to ask it, with what's going on. But if I'm a CEO, member of the C-suite, or an executive, what are some of the key takeaways that I should take away from this data in the services sector?
Yeah, on the and from a serious perspective, the rental and leasing side. And capital equipment required for doing construction services, utilities, that type of thing. As the interest rates stay at a sustained, and cost of capital, say at a sustained high level, people need to repair more. They keep their cars longer, they keep their equipment longer. And so repair services is one thing that you would expect to see continue to increase as we continue to have these high interest rates that they don't seem to be flowing through, and we're not seeing interest rate cuts coming anytime soon. So I think from that perspective, we could probably see other services continue to be on the growth side and at the end of the growth side for a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, Steve, I appreciate your time. Those were all the questions that I had. I mean, is there anything that I haven't asked or any dynamic that we have not discussed that you think might be important for the viewers to know about this month's data?
Yeah, I think you covered it well. We have a good solid month this month. Tariffs are the big question out there, and then additional budget cuts from the public sector and how that'll flow through to the services industry is a watch out.
Yeah, I know we've talked a lot over the course of our time, doing this broadcast, how services just has, seemed to be resilient in the face of all that's going on. And it especially had an impact on the manufacturing sector, but, services have been hanging in there. I guess based on that thought, any, forecast or any thoughts about what, the next, quarter or so might hold?
I was worried about this more often back in the summertime, where we saw some vacillation between contraction and expansion, and we were hovering around 51, 52. These numbers all look pretty solid. They'll hang together well, and as long as smart minds meet and come with compromises to make things work internationally, I have very little that I'm concerned about. If we smack 25% tariffs on all Mexican goods and all Canadian goods, that's a different story.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, it'll be an interesting dynamic to watch. Thanks for joining us today. For more information, you can feel free to go to ismworld.org, where in a little bit you can read our roundup article that details a lot of what Steve and I have discussed here, as well as how markets are responding to the data. And if you would like to be a part of the ISM Manufacturing Services or Hospital Business Survey panels that help compile data for the report on business, visit ismworld.org/join the panel. for more information. Now, don't forget to be here for the second half of our doubleheader when we discuss the February manufacturing PMI with Timothy R. Fiore. He's the chair of the ISM Manufacturing Businesses Services Committee, or Survey Committee. And as for services, we'll see you back here in a month's time when we break down the March ISM report on business. So for my teammates, Steve Miller, and some good people who helped us behind the scenes, Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens, I'm Dan Zeiger, and hopefully we'll see you in about 3.5 hours.